The flight from New York to Los Angeles began like any other. Passengers shuffled into their seats, flight attendants smiled their polished smiles, and the dull roar of engines hummed beneath conversations, laughter, and the crinkle of snack wrappers. A young girl in seat 14A sat quietly by the window, a paperback novel in her lap, her braid draped casually over one shoulder. She didn't look like anyone special. Just another passenger, one among hundreds. For hours the journey was smooth, as routine as air travel could be. The seatbelt sign dimmed, babies slept, laptops flickered with glowing screens. Then, in an instant, the ordinary shattered. A violent jolt rocked the aircraft, tossing cups of coffee into laps, rattling overhead bins until they popped open like startled mouths. A shriek pierced the cabin as the plane lurched again, dipping just enough to make stomachs rise into throats. Lights flickered, the air filled with the harsh hiss of alarms. Flight attendants froze for a second, their professional masks slipping before they snapped into action, strapping themselves in. Passengers clutched armrests so tightly their knuckles blanched white. A mother hugged her crying child. Someone whispered prayers into trembling hands. Then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, forced calm stretched tight like a fraying rope. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost both engines." The words hung heavy in the cabin, almost unbelievable. Both engines. Not one. Not a minor glitch. Both. The plane was no longer a soaring machine but a heavy bird with broken wings. Gasps and screams erupted. A man staggered down the aisle, demanding answers. Another passenger broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Yet in the middle of chaos, seat 14A remained strangely composed. The young girl closed her book with deliberate calm, the faintest crease of focus touching her brow. While everyone else clung to despair, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Eyes turned toward her. Some passengers blinked in disbelief. How could anyone walk at a time like this? The aisle shook under her steps as turbulence rattled the plane again, but she moved forward, steady, almost defiant. Flight attendants tried to stop her, voices taut with fear, but something in her eyes, clear, determined, unshaken, made them pause. She continued toward the cockpit door, her braid swinging with each measured step. Behind her, whispers began to spread. Who is she? What is she doing? She's just a passenger girl. But it was the way she carried herself, with a confidence that cut through the hysteria, that silenced the noise. Panic gave way to curiosity, even awe. People, frozen in fear moments before, now watched her as if she were carrying more than herself, like she carried the fragile hope of everyone on board. By the time she reached the cockpit, even the crying had softened. Strangers leaned into the aisle, eyes locked on her slim figure disappearing beyond the heavy door. They didn't know her name, her story, or her reason. All they knew was that in the face of despair, she had stood when no one else dared to. And that act alone, before anyone knew what she was capable of, already made her unforgettable. The cockpit was a blur of flashing red lights and warning alarms, the kind of chaos only pilots were trained to understand. Yet at that moment, even they were losing their grip. The captain's hands tightened on the yoke, his jaw clenched, sweat beading across his brow. The co-pilot muttered frantic calculations, his voice trembling as he read off altitude numbers that kept falling. The plane wasn't flying. It was gliding, bleeding speed and hope with every second. The door opened, and to their surprise, it wasn't another crew member who entered but the young woman from 14A. For a moment, both pilots stared at her, startled, almost offended. She was just a passenger, an intruder in the sanctum of trained professionals. But before they could demand she leave, she spoke. "I'm a trained flight simulator engineer. I know these controls. You need my help." The words landed sharp and precise, with none of the panic that soaked the cabin behind her. She spoke like someone who had been here before, someone who had already rehearsed the worst-case scenario in 1,000 digital skies. The captain hesitated, torn between disbelief and desperation. He wanted to say no, to shove her back into the cabin where passengers belonged. But one look at his co-pilot, pale, overwhelmed, fear creeping into his eyes, made him falter. For all their years of training, nothing had prepared them for losing both engines over a crowded city. "Show me," he said finally, his voice low, as if the act of giving her control might itself jinx their last chance. She stepped forward with a calmness that contrasted violently against the blaring alarms. Her fingers brushed the panels, tracing buttons and switches not with hesitation but familiarity. She rerouted hydraulic systems, muttering commands under her breath, the language of machines flowing off her tongue like prayer. She directed the co-pilot to reset the APU, ordered a restart sequence, adjusted airflow valves, all in swift succession. At first, the pilots watched her in suspicion. But suspicion slowly shifted into astonishment as the plane, instead of diving faster, began to respond. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough for them to feel the shift in gravity, enough to sense that survival wasn't yet out of reach. Behind the locked door, passengers strained to catch a glimpse through the small window. They whispered among themselves, voices hushed with equal parts fear and wonder. She knows what she's doing. She's not even one of them, and yet look. The captain found himself following her lead, asking questions he never thought he'd ask a stranger in his cockpit. Even as his hands remained on the yoke, his eyes flicked to her, trusting her words, her certainty. And in those tense, endless minutes, the authority of rank dissolved. She was no longer just a passenger girl, she was the axis on which the fate of 200 souls turned. For the first time since the engines failed, hope returned to the air. Fragile, trembling, but real. The impossible suddenly seemed like it could be done. The runway stretched below them like a silver thread, glowing faintly against the darkness of night. From the cabin, it looked impossibly narrow, impossibly far, like a fragile lifeline drawn across the earth. Every passenger's heart pounded in rhythm with the engines that refused to roar back to life. The cabin was silent now. No more screaming, no more sobbing. Fear had given way to stunned anticipation, every eye fixed on the young woman who had disappeared into the cockpit and taken charge of the sky. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom. "She's guiding us down." For a heartbeat, the words didn't register. Then whispers rippled through the cabin. "She, the girl from 14A. Murmurs built into a quiet hum of disbelief and awe, parents holding children tighter, strangers gripping each other's hands like old friends. People had expected to die in terror, but now they found themselves watching for a miracle. Inside the cockpit, the tension was a living thing, pressing against skin and bone. The girl's braid clung to her back with sweat as she leaned over the controls, her voice steady, issuing instructions with unwavering clarity. Her hands moved in concert with the pilots, adjusting flaps, correcting pitch, slowing descent inch by inch. The aircraft groaned under the strain, metal, protesting, but it obeyed. The captain no longer questioned her presence. He had become her shadow, his trust absolute, his survival instinct overridden by her certainty. "Steady, steady," she murmured, eyes fixed on the approaching lights. The wheels touched asphalt with a scream that tore through the silence of the night. The cabin jolted violently, bodies thrown forward, breath ripped from lungs. The plane bounced once, twice, skidding across the tarmac in a shower of sparks. Gasps erupted, but she didn't flinch. Her hand stayed firm on the throttle, her voice a beacon cutting through chaos. Hold it steady." The captain obeyed. The brakes shrieked, rubber burning, the smell of friction flooding the cockpit. The plane shuddered, fighting to stop, every soul inside suspended in that endless moment between life and death. Then, slowly, impossibly, the speed bled away. The shrieking softened, the rumble dulled. The plane, against every odd, against every prayer thought too late, rolled to a halt. For one long second, silence swallowed the world. No one dared to breathe. Then, as realization swept through the cabin, the silence shattered into thunder. Applause erupted like a storm, passengers weeping, cheering, throwing arms around each other. Strangers who had entered as nothing more than seatmates clung together as survivors. Phones rose, flashes blinked, voices cried out, "She saved us." The cockpit door opened, and she stepped out into the aisle. Her face was pale, her braids slightly undone, but her eyes glowed with the calm of someone who had not been broken by fear. Passengers stared at her as if she were something more than human, a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. Reporters would soon call her the passenger girl who landed 212 souls. But when someone tried to crown her a hero, she shook her head softly, almost shyly. "I wasn't the hero," she said. "I just couldn't let fear fly." And in that single line, she didn't just land a plane. She landed in their hearts forever.